Hello, welcome to the Power of Our Story. And today we have Marlon Marrache. He's coming back for a part two. He came and shared his amazing story yesterday, or last week, I'm sorry. And now he's coming back. He's going to be sharing more of the legal side of his work. And this is something I think a lot of law enforcement officers are interested in. So I'm going to read his bio and then I'm going to hand it over to Marlon. He says, I am a retired 24-year veteran LAPD police sergeant. During my 15 years as a sergeant, I've prosecuted cops when I was in internal affairs, cops being charged with false statements, and I have defended cops when they were involved in officer-involved shootings. Thus, I have considerable expertise in police disciplinary matters from both sides. And also just want to give you a heads up. Marlon does have a podcast coming soon, and it's called Details. So Marlon, welcome back. It's great to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back. Did you get a chance? If you can, why don't you go ahead and play the little pre-launch to the audience here. Maybe they haven't seen it. I don't know if you can do it or not.
Let me just try very quickly. Okay, just one
Pretty
moment.
excited about that. Okay. I was going to say thank you for the introduction. Every time someone does an intro and they say he's prosecuted cops, that just sounds so harsh. But you know what? I'm a true believer that nobody wants a bad actor on their organization, and which is one of the reasons why internal affairs exist probably in every single agency. It's because no one wants to deal with or be a partner with when your integrity and your honesty is on the line. And if you happen to cross that line, then you know what, the chief of police is going to have to terminate you. So, I would like to at least, I know part one was a lot about my journey, how I got here and all that good stuff. And you're right, we ran out of time about what is it that I'm doing. One of the exciting things that is up and running now is this details, the breakdown. I had this idea about details from about, I got to say, maybe it's been a concept of mine for a couple of years. When I was in media as a PIO, I always felt that the public doesn't really know what an officer goes through when they're involved in an officer-involved shooting, specifically in what we call an OIS, right? And I wanted to put that in life now that I'm retired. And all I wanted to do was just to buy this mic and buy a light and sit in my room and pretty much, to break down some video and tell you, how is it that the department sees an officer when they're involved in a shooting. And I would think that the audience will get, a really good understanding and awareness, but what I didn't really take in consideration is the psychological and the emotional consequence from an officer-involved shooting, let alone some trauma out of it, right? And so what I did was, not only did I decided to break down video, I also decided to invite guests who have been involved in police shootings so that he or she can tell their story. And last night, luckily, my boss, who just retired, came into the studio and knocked out a home run and told a story about a shooting that he was involved in 21 years ago. And so I suppose it was very therapeutic for him. I do know that, like I said before, I think every shooting has its consequences. There's definitely legal consequences. There's definitely emotional consequences. And for some, there might be some physical consequences, right? And so I thought it was very, very important that, we humanize what he went through, and he really, really dug deep and started really telling us, how emotional and all these factors that took into play, just phenomenal. So I'm going to edit it and it's going to come out soon. And all of you be the first ones to, to view it, and so move forward. So I invite anybody that has any questions regarding police discipline, right? Misconduct. I think that we can all agree that when an officer gets in trouble, it has a very adverse effect in their lives. So here we are.
Okay, so you want this to be us
Yeah.
kind of have a comment section. I know from hearing people's stories, I have heard how hard that is. It is really interesting to hear this side because again, as a civilian, I had no clue because you don't see that on social media. If you don't know police officers, you never hear that side. So it's very disturbing to hear kind of what actually happens and what people go through.
Very, very, very true and accurate as the way you describe it. I would only say that the concept and my motivation to do all this is because it's just that nobody really knows what happens in an OIS. They don't. Um, my beloved LAPD in 2015, I want to say by the way of political pressure, set the standard of doing what they call a 72-hour community briefing video. I think it's called a community briefing. What basically happens is you can go on YouTube right now and go under LAPD, and then it will pretty much give you a really good summary of the categorical use of force, OIS being the most popular. And the commanding officer will tell you, here's what happened, who, what, where, and how. They will show you body worn video, and they're very good at depicting exactly what happened. They'll slow down and show you body worn video, where the weapon, was seen and the consequences as to why there was a shooting, all that good stuff. But what my beloved LAPD doesn't do, and no other department does in general, is that after that particular community briefing video, whatever they call it, you just don't know what happens in the end. You don't know what the officers went through. You don't know if it was in policy or out of policy. And you don't know or have an understanding as to what the officer was thinking at the time that he actually went through this. And more important is the aftermath, right? It's the emotional component, as to how it affected him and his family and his loved ones. And so that's what this show, podcast video show is really all about.
That's really, yeah, that's really good. I mean, I know that they need support. I mean, just because of the stories that I have heard. Interestingly enough, today is a day that we don't have most of our police officers on. I think, they're on vacation. And so some of the people that maybe have some experience with this are not on tonight, but I definitely want to open it up here. Do you have any?
Chris and Daniel have a lot of questions. I know they do.
I actually don't have that many. I never got reprimanded. I never did anything wrong. You and I had a long conversation on my podcast around all this, and I never lied, so I never got in trouble. So, and I was never involved in a shooting, thank God.
Yes.
But yeah, I do know I have talked to a lot of people that have been involved in shootings, and that aftermath of what happens directly afterwards is it's necessary, but also the way that they're dealt with, they're a lot of times they're dealt with like a criminal
Yes.
for doing their job and what they had to do. So I know, yeah, that's sort of something that I know a lot of people would probably, people that haven't been involved in stuff would probably be very intrigued on knowing kind of how that could maybe be different, or how that could, how leadership could actually step up around that kind of stuff. I guess would be kind of my curiosity of what your thoughts would be on that, of how leadership could handle an officer involved shooting differently.
Good question, because that leads me to my guest yesterday, Leonard, who really spoke about the reactionary time when someone is under a stress level that they're not really familiar with. So there's science out there, of course, we can all agree with that, where um, individuals react to a situation of high stress in very different ways, right? One would freeze, one would flight, one reacts immediately. It just depends what the adrenaline, with all the all the different uh, uh, signs and wires that happens in your brain as to what actually you know um, uh, causes the officer to do something or not do something. Yeah, it all depends, right? And so for him, he said when the actual suspect was shooting at him, it didn't quite really register in terms of that he was being fired on. He hit this pause, whether he was just not so much startled. He was just it was a very strange feeling, and then out of nowhere, within a matter of a second or two, it hit him that you know what, I need to fire back. You know, as opposed to the partner, because it was three shooters, as opposed to the partner next to him. He happened to react completely right away. And so what Chris is bringing up is such an important factor that unfortunately not many agencies, right? Not many police departments really take in consideration the psychological component of an officer doing what it is, how they reacted. And so if you're going to recommend, and pass judgment, and you're going to be put under a lot of scrutiny as to why you fired each individual round, well, it would be, I suppose, more effective if you can take that psychological reactionary component into, your consideration in the rendering, whether it's going to be in policy or out of policy. In leadership, we're not there, and here we are, decades and decades later, and you would think that would be. You give another example will be when Leonard was talking about sleep deprivation. That's huge. I mean, imagine you working 3 days in a row, and you're working, not 12-hour shifts. By the time you get home, and you're looking at about 12, 14, maybe, probably 14, maybe 15 hours. Maybe if you get a later rest, whatever the case may be. And then here you are on your fourth day on your 12-hour shift, and right when your shift's about to get over, you get involved in an OIS. And so if you took, 3 days, oh gosh, let's see, if you work 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., so 3 days, you get home, maybe you're looking at about 20 hours of sleep in 4 days, and so here you are, getting involved in an OIS, and by the time you're going to get compelled, the department, in my department, they compel you. So by the time you're actually going to sit down and be compelled to give your statement as to what is it that you did and how you did it, you're looking at about another 15 hours. So you're completely deprived from your brain really functioning. And that's where, a lot of inconsistencies, you might not remember what happened. And some agencies are very good about just saying, hey, you know what, send them home. And within 24 hours, you can talk to my client. A lot of attorneys do that. Hey, don't talk to my client tonight. Give them 24 to 40 hours and he'll give you a full statement. So that's where the show, in my concept and idea of doing this was to get that story so that people can hear what exactly officers go through when they're involved in an OIS. Post officer involved shooting.
It's just, it's so interesting hearing these things as a civilian, somebody who is not, because, when you're in anything or in any agency, I think it's human nature. You get kind of used to how things are done. But from somebody outside, it just seems like the agencies are not setting our police officers up well. Like, especially with the culture of it's a bit of a witch hunt, right? I mean, it really is. The culture is not supportive right now. I think there's a lot of people who are, but they're not as loud. There's a lot of people who do and are grateful, but and then to hear when you do something as traumatic as maybe have to shoot somebody, which I think, again, I didn't understand so much until being on these calls. You don't understand how much the officer goes through having to actually shoot his gun and then having to go through the protocol without getting that emotional support. And I don't know, just to me, like, imagining what that's like, it
Yes.
just seems
It's
so
a life. It's
overwhelming.
Well, you know what? I couldn't agree with you more, Sarah. Look, like I said yesterday on the show, I said, you know what? There's nobody wins when there's an OIS. Nobody. Whatever stakeholder you can think of, whether it's a community, the department, your partners, your loved ones, your family, your wife, there is nothing to gain out of getting involved in such a traumatic event. But there's a lot to learn from it, and there's a lot of educational, to get from it. And so for me, um, I'll just give an example. 21 years later, he comes in and tells a story. He was never asked, hey, how did you feel when you went through all this? I even asked him yesterday. I said, look, um, here we are. You engaged in deadly force. Did you go home that day? Did you have a couple of days off? Or what happened? Did you have to go see a psychologist? Why don't you kind of walk us through the process after this happened when you got home? And by the way, when did you get home? Because I know you didn't get home like right away. You probably got home about 10 hours later, after doing your 12-hour shift, whatever that case may be. So, and he explained it, you know what? He says, no one even bothered to ask me something like that. So the concept of really getting the emotional component out of this complete, tragic event is so important for me to let the audience and the public know. So, it's pretty good stuff.
I have a question, Marlon. Did you ask like the other side of it, like the personal side? Because I know we had one of our favorite leads and he was in a shooting and the person died. And it became high profile because it was a homeless person. And he was one of our favorite leads. Everyone local loved him. And then they were upset. The community was upset because a homeless person was killed. And then they found out who it was. And then nobody liked him anymore. There was so much talk about him afterwards, and he's still, in our area and he's still working. But now there's that divide where like he was really well loved by the community. Now it's half and half. When he came back, now half don't like him because he killed someone. And I'm just curious if you like delve into that side when they come back.
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, as we all know, each tragic, police shooting has its own set of circumstances. And the one you just described is just got to be, it's got to be so tragic, right? Because the first thing they're going to do is, they're going to pretty much hate him for what he did, but no one's going to bother to ask him, hey, how do you feel about all this? That's the missing piece, of all this, the overall picture, I suppose is the best way to describe it. But for my guest yesterday, Leonard, what I didn't mention to you is that a week before they encounter with the suspect, he was pulled over by a CHP officer and engaged in a gunfire. He actually had a shooting. He tried to kill a CHP officer. So he was wanted for attempted murder already. It just so happens that a week later, he was spotted and they found him, and so a foot pursuit ensues and he starts hiding in the trash can. And while he's hiding in the trash can, there's a standoff for about 20 minutes where he's in the trash can. Canine comes, Canine got involved. They detected where he was at. And then, of course, I described to you, that they were involved in the shooting. He happens to peek out or he jumps out of the trash can and starts firing away at the officers. So those particular circumstances, obviously for him, are pretty tragic. But the ones that you described, it's got to be even worse because that's got to be so controversial. Here you have a homeless individual who's probably suffering from mental illness. Who knows, right? And next thing you know, he engaged into deadly force. The entire community is probably going to be against that officer. And you're absolutely right, Brenda. No one bothered to even ask what the officer's gone through or how he feels about it emotionally. So good point.
One of the worst things that I can remember is having somebody write a headline that says, "Officer shoots deaf citizen." It didn't happen to me, but I'm sure it's happened someplace. And that's tragic for everybody. Unless the officer was in fear of his life, in which case that didn't matter, but or in fear of the life of another. But I was involved in 2 shootings, and
Good. You're going to be one of my guests. Go ahead, Paul.
the first one involved a foot pursuit, and I had a shotgun out. And I took sight on the target, and the picture was not clear. There was a Korean lady and her toddler walking up behind him. Not part of the action, just happened to be there. That's a no-shoot situation, even though he's pointing a gun at me. And you get pretty religious and things like that happen, because all you're dealing with is hope.
Absolutely, absolutely. And seeing it's stories like that that really have an impact on all of us, you know. So I made it a promise to myself that when I retired, I really wanted to really open up this door so that the public can hear what officers really go through. And by the way, it's not so much officers, just so you know. I mean, I'm trying to expand everybody who is affected by or has witnessed or was part of the OIS. So for example, what I'm trying to do also is try to get a hold of maybe paramedics, right? Paramedics that responded to the scene of a police shooting. And maybe they can come in as a guest and kind of tell us their story, you know, as to, you know, hey, maybe I saved their lives, or, you know, they died on scene and this is what I was thinking. These are the procedures, you know, so on and so forth, you know. I'm also wanting to bring, you know, somewhat experts, right, that actually evaluate and review officer involved shootings, and you know what factors are to take in consideration. I think that's very important for the public and the audience to know.
Can
So
Can I run something by as well?
yeah,
So-
absolutely.
Just so I understand, looking at, seeing how the officer that was involved in the shooting, how they felt afterwards. I know you're talking about potentially bringing in some of the other first responders. We had one, I was 20 years old. I wasn't even old enough to buy my off-duty guns, and I was a cop. So, and this is what I'm thinking, just running this by, if you're gonna kind of, bring the officers in that have been in the shooting, get their perspective. If you want to get the first responders, like the medics or the firemen. With mine, we had an icebreaker event where it brought 3,000 people. It was to the Lansing Center. They had people from Grand Rapids, Chicago, Detroit, Flint. They oversold this place by about 2,000 tickets. So I'm 20 years old, and everybody was done. It's back when the fad was the white T-shirts and the jeans, and I had a parking lot that had about 800 people in it, and there were cars and motorcycles, and there were more guns there than our department.
Wow.
Well, so some girl comes over to me and she's like, "Hey, this kid's been shot over there." I'm like, whatever. I would have heard that, but because there's all kinds of stuff going on. Well, somebody else came over and they said, "Hey, this kid has been shot." So my partner and I go running over there. Kid's laying on the ground with it's funny, having a TBI. I can forget what I did yesterday, but I can tell you what the kid was wearing, his name, what he's, what it smelled like, who the shooter was. So we get over to this kid. His name is Marcus Ford, lying on the ground with a sucking chest wound, looking at him, said, "Hey, trying to get a dying declaration. You're going to die. Who shot you?" Well, as I look up, the guy that ended up shooting him, there was a good 800 people in there. He looks at me, starts shooting at me. Well, when he starts running, he shoots over the back of his head as he runs. He drops 10 people. So I'm weaving in and out of traffic there, trying to get to him. Couldn't get a good sight picture. So what I'm getting at is, just a thought to explore. So we bring the officers in that's been in the OIS. Maybe you want to bring in your medics who had to assess the situation, or clean the coagulated blood up, or just their perspective. I wasn't a shooter as far as, in an OIS, because I couldn't do it because of the spot. And the guy's name was Willie Lee Sims. We picked him up in Detroit because he shot. He literally, as he ran, he looked at me and he shot. And then he started running over his head or behind his shoulder, running behind him, just started popping rounds off. So he ended up shooting 9 people that night, and the thing that really got to me was this kid, literally, when we caught him, we said, "Why did you shoot this kid?" The kid, he came from Chicago. His father was a very, very high up for General Motors. I'll never forget that individual. Willie Sims looked at me and he goes, "Because he looked at my girl wrong." And I'm like, "You piece of you know, so I will never forget his father, Marcus Ford's dad. Never saw this man in my life. I'll never forget him. Even with all the stuff I forget, his dad was such a bigwig with GM. They flew him up from Chicago every day for the trial. When trial was all said and done, they gave Willie Lee Sims 50 to 80 years he got. His dad walked over to me and he goes, "Sir," I'm looking at him like, "Yes." He goes, "I want to know, were you the last one to see my son alive?" I said, "Yes, sir, I was." Because I had to get on the stand about a dying declaration. He goes, "How was he?" I said, "I did the best I could to keep him safe." And he goes, "That's all I asked." Give me a hug. Never saw the guy again. So when moral of my story is, you know, something else you might want to think about is you bring your OIS officers in that have been involved, then you bring your medics in. But to me, that's something I'll never forget that kid looking
That
at me
is-
trying to talk, but he had a sucking chest, but he couldn't say anything. Then I'll never forget
no.
his father, you know, and the fact that this guy shot at me and then he ran and he was shooting over the back of his
Yeah.
head. So it's just another avenue for you to maybe explore when you're interviewing.
Absolutely, Aaron. That is
Yeah.
so compelling.
Mhm.
It's powerful.
It was hard,
You
man.
know,
It was
I don't
real
think,
hard because I
yeah,
felt like a
well, you
failure.
know what? Well,
I feel
mean,
like a failure because, you know, it was, could I have shot him? I'm very confident. I was on a tag team for 10 years, not at that point, but I was very
Right,
confident. But
right.
no officer is going to shoot at somebody in a crowd of 800 people. So I was
course.
angry. I felt like a failure, you know, and a lot of us did. And were we? Absolutely not. We did what we could. But the kid died right in front of us. I mean, you know, he died.
Wow.
But we never fired a gun. Well, we sure got fired at.
Yeah. Well, it's close enough. And you know what? Yeah. I don't, you know, again, I'm not going to make my scope, you know, that narrow. I mean,
Well, you don't
stories like
get to.
that. Yeah.
Just food for thought. That's all.
Thank you, Aaron.
Yes,
That's
sir.
just powerful. You and I definitely got to keep in touch because
I would love that.
I'll be more than happy
Yes, sir.
to have you share that story. And
I would love to.
it's these stories like that that really, speaking of stories and speaking of events, we decided to actually also do an actual breakdown, because the show is called Details, the breakdown of the incident that's happened in Arkansas. So if you haven't seen what happened in Arkansas police, this excessive force that just happened a couple days ago, it's pretty bad. Danny, I know you're shaking your head. I think Paul, Chris, I kind of see you shaking your head. If you haven't seen it, you got to go watch it. It's a cell phone video of a standby female that's in her car. I believe she's in the back seat and she's filming 3 officers just beating down this arrestee, right? He was, I believe he was at a liquor store earlier, and he was wanted for battery, wanted for something else. I know he was charged with like 4 different criminal allegations. But if you watch the video, it's very, very disturbing. Now, does that have to do with an OIS? Absolutely not. But it is a current event. Everybody in the nation's talking about it. It's got a George Floyd, you know, component to it, because it just, you got to watch it, Sarah, or whoever else hasn't watched it. It's pretty disturbing. So next week, we're going to actually break that down and discuss, you know, some of the expertise that I can provide and let you know, what my opinion, I certainly don't want to pass complete judgment because I don't know the complete circumstances. I haven't watched body worn video. There's got to be testimony and there's a full-fledged, comprehensive, investigation going on. But what I can tell you is just the thought process of what command staff, would be looking at when it comes to using excessive force. So
That was hard to watch. I think Chris has a question.
Marlon, thank you so much for being here. So I'm a bit late. So I come into just that you guys talk about OASs and those affected in your podcast and so on. What are your thoughts about as much of the, many of us have been through many critical incidents, OASs and so on. As much as it affects us, what is your thoughts in diving into the families? Because I would argue that those things probably affect our families much more than us. Every day that we walk out of the door, I never thought, I hope today's not the day that I want to go home, but every day that I walk out, my family thinks that. And that's kind of that reinforcer. Once you're involved in one of those things, and then God forbid it's a high profile thing or political controversy or whatever, what are your thoughts on that? I guess I was very generic with that thinking.
Well, it falls under the umbrella, and yeah, I'm with you, brother. I would love for a family member to come in and tell me the story as to how he or she, I suppose she felt about her husband, or how he felt about her wife, or whatever, their loved ones, and tell me what it was when he came home, or tell me how it was, you know, the behavior, or was there any change of behavior? What happened? Did it cause conflict in your marriage? Did you see the behavior change? Oh, absolutely. Would love that. And while you're talking about that particular door to open, I would also like to open the door for the victims, right? I mean, there could be a story where I bring in someone who was actually saved. Hey, LEPD or this police officer saved my life. And let me tell you how it happened. You know, so this is room. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. And I guess to dive into it a little bit more, not just on the podcast or your interview series, but being a senior guy and leadership that you were, what is your perspective or what was your guidance piece as a leader to help reassure those family members, the husbands, the wives, the kids, and so on? As a peer support member of my agency, I talked to most officers that are involved in OISs, and many of them, the spouses, kids are like, "We want you to quit. We need to quit," because there is that reinforcer. From your perspective, in a leadership position, how would you go into dive into that?
Ooh, that's a tough question, man. That's a tough question, because no matter how much leadership I can provide for a tragic incident like that, these are personal decisions that and these are feelings that I certainly, no matter how much leadership I can bring, I can change. All I can say is make sure that your husband or your loved one, right, your wife, whomever, is properly trained. It's in the right mindset. Hey, if there's harmony and happiness in the home, you know what, your performance at work, is definitely going to be, focused. I remember when I was going through my divorce, my dad told me, and this is so true. My dad said, "Listen, if you can't walk in your house and take a breath of fresh air, then you got problems. That's when you know you need to go." And he's right. He was 100% spot on. And so, about the best advice that I can give, or any reassurance, as you mentioned, Chris, is, you know what, and keep in mind, we are talking about, we're not talking about, we're talking about a very fraction of officers being involved in an OIS, right? I mean, when I was doing this job as a defense rep, representing officers as they're going through this whole process, the agency at the time had about 9,700, 9,400, 9,500, 9,500 sworn officers. So if there's only about, I think at one point in 2017, there was close to 100 OISs. Well, I should say about maybe 80 or 90. So you kind of do the math. I mean, that's not even 10%. That's probably like 8%. So 8% of the population of police officers, and that year will get involved in an OIS. Now, of course, you go under that website, the Fraternal Order Police, the FOP, they give out stats all the time. And unfortunately, in today's policing, the numbers of officers getting involved nationwide have increased dramatically. And that is, Sarah, like a whole nother topic, that we can cover a little bit, where, today's policing is not what it is. At least for me, it wasn't 25 years ago. And Paul can tell you, it's not what it was, during his time, because now you actually have individuals who actually wake up and they want to go and assassinate and kill police officers. They want to ambush you. That back in my days was unheard of. unheard of, completely unheard of. You know, there was a lot of respect, the image, you know, and the, you know, what comes with being a cop, you know, had a lot of, you know, not so much, I mean, I had a lot of respect, but it had a lot of, you know, of somewhat of hierarchy. You know, you were looked as, you know what, I'm going to help you, you know, come here and help me.
We had a
Where
lot of support. We had a lot
of support. And by the way, I mean, you know, there's a lot of places, and Paul can tell you, I mean, there's a lot of places here in Southern California, the majority of community members within that city are very supportive of the police. But if you start talking about Los Angeles, that's a whole different story. The same goes with Chicago. The same goes with New York. You know, it just goes, you know, it just happens where, you know, where for whatever reason, it happens in a lot of big cities.
Well, thank you so much for your holistic career of service. I love that it's kind of come full circle. You kind of looked at all aspects of it. So thank you very much, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it.
Marlon, do you have time for one more question?
Of course.
Okay, Daniel.
Outstanding. I have never been in OIS, but I had a battle buddy who was an MP with me in the Army. He left active duty, joined the reserves, and then became a police officer in Palo Alto. He was involved in OIS. Subject with a knife wouldn't drop, came at him. And I know it affected him pretty bad. He left the force and ended up becoming a city bus driver.
Wow.
But he stayed in the reserves, and you know, he ended up retiring as a command sergeant major. And now he's a marriage and family therapist associate out in California, and he's you know, he's counseling people. So yeah, he's had quite the journey.
If somehow, some way you can connect me with him, Danny, I would love to talk to him. See if he would like to share a story.
Absolutely.
Well, gosh, this seems so short and sweet.
Yeah.
Marlon, I know he has to go. I thank you so much for coming on. This has always been a very interesting subject, I think, to me personally too, just because it's hard to imagine having a job like a police officer, law enforcement officer job, and going through what you do go through, and not really having the emotional support when the worst thing happens. It definitely seems like a very important conversation, especially with where the culture is at on like social media and the news. I just, you know, we need you. We really need you. If people don't understand that, I don't know what they're thinking. So I appreciate having this conversation, and I would love to have more of them.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, another component of what I want to do in my show is have a panel. So you'll be the first one that I call. So what we'll do is we'll look at, you know, at an OIS, and you know what, just fire away, you know, with questions, and, you know, hopefully we can get a little bit of understanding, you know.
Okay,
it's true that the 8% of the officers had an OIS. The fact is that took 80% of the department's time.
Yeah.
You know,
Exactly. Yeah.
it's like the 80-20 rule, only it's upside down.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Very well said. You can count on that. But yeah, let me get some episodes in once we go all that, and let's do it again for sure.
great.
Would love to.
Thank you so much, Marlon. I appreciate it.